All right, Jabosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Shvat, Mrs. Samuel, for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month with immense gratitude for the refuahs from Hashem and the merit of a refuah shlema for all of those in need, in the schus of our brave soldiers, and the schus of the return of our hostages. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Saeed and Sima Haken, for dedicating all the Sherman this week, in memory of Saeed's mother, Taji Barati Bethari Bas Harav Meir Moshe Zichron Livracha, Yehuda and Bracha Buchwalter, in memory of Rabbi Yehuda's father of Asher Buchwalter Zichron Livracha. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Menashe and Bracha Ephron, in honor of the bris of baby boy Ephron, with Mazel Tov to Ben Sion and Alana Ephron and the entire family, and in memory of Beatrice Ephron Brena Bas Alti Rachmiel Zichron Livracha, whose 11th yahrzeit is today. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slavin Aliyah, the families in Nechama, this little boy in Meretz Hashem is Zorcha to enter into Bris Hashem Avinu Bizmano, and his parents are Zorcha Legadlu Torah, Ulechupa, Ulemaisim Tovim. Our soldiers should be successful, and all of our hostages should be returned in Meretz Hashem to their families. Bekarov. But so with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Ayin Zayin 77. And we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Ayin Vav Amud Beis 76b, and let's actually pick up. We got, I think, towards the end of the daf, or towards the middle of the Amud, right? Ketzad Lan Lefnei Zrika. All right, so let's actually just pause for just a second, just to back up a little bit. So remember again, what are we doing? Like, excellent question. Haven't really been able to answer that for a little while now. So just listen, we had a statement in the Mishnah, right? So remember again, the Mishnah quoted a case. The case was actually a pretty straightforward case. We dealt with it yesterday. That was the case of Ganav v'Hikdish bi'achar kach tavach u'mishalim. Reuven steals a sheep from Shimon. He goes ahead and he's makdish it. After he's makdish it, he slaughters/steals it. He sold it /slaughtered it, right? It's and/or, right? So now what's the halacha? What did the Mishnah say? In that case, what does he do? He has to pay kefil, but he doesn't pay dalid v'hei. That was the case. Straightforward. Why not? He pays kefil. Why? Because he stole. Makes sense. He doesn't pay dalid v'hei. Why? Because remember again, the obligation of dalid and hay is only when you're slaughtering/selling a sheep that belongs to another person. In this case, because Reuven was makdish, therefore it's no longer Shimon's sheep. Because it's no longer Shimon's sheep, it's the sheep of Hekdish. Then ultimately, again, Reuven's not going to be chayiv dalid v'hei. Remember again, Rashi pointed out it has to be that we're talking about a case where after Reuven sold it, Shimon had yeush. Because otherwise, again, Reuven would not have the ability to be makdish. Okay, so that was the case, pretty straightforward. Where it got a little bit confusing was Rabbi Shimon comes along. Rabbi Shimon says, "This, what are we talking about over here? This is so in a case where it depends." Rabbi Shimon say, in the case of hektish, it depends. What does it depend on? If it's a case of kadshim sheyesh lahem achrayis, meaning that the owner has a responsibility for the animal, then ultimately, again, which means the animal still, so to speak, even if it's hektish, still remains in the owner's domain. So therefore, again, Rabbi Shimon will say that should be chayiv dalid v'hei. If he doesn't have achrayis, then you're not chayiv dalid v'hei. Shabbos says, so now in yesterday's daf, towards the end of Amud Aleph, what we were trying to figure out is, so what's the case of Rabbi Shimon? If Rabbi Shimon is talking about that you're actually stealing a consecrated animal, so let's analyze this. Right? Because there's a lot of things that kind of happen together over here. So first of all, Rabbi Shimon subscribes to the idea that shchita she'ena re'uya is lo shma shchita. That in general, if you shecht an animal and it's not fit for consumption, that's not considered to be a bona fide shchita. If it's not a bona fide shchita, then halacha l'maisa what? And you shouldn't be chayiv dalid v'hei. Furthermore, again, if at the end of the day we're talking about a case where the thief is stealing a consecrated animal and maybe even offering it up as a carbon, is that not a case of chazra karen lebailov? That ultimately, again, the principle goes back to the owner. In other words, think about this just a moment. If Shimon has a shlomim, right, and Reuven steals the animal from him and offers it up as a shlomim, so as much as Reuven has stolen something, at the end of the day, we could kind of say what? mission accomplished. Shimon wanted to offer up a shlamim, so Ruvain offered it up. Ruvain did offer up the shlamim. Okay, well, so a lot of times in life, the things that we want to happen don't exactly happen the way we wanted them to happen, but as long as it kind of materializes, so it's good enough. It's good enough. So that's called chazra karen l'baylim. So we'll say, so therefore, we have two interpretations as to how this case could work. One was Rabbi Yochanan and one was Reish Lakish. So Rabbi Yochanan said the case is b'shochet tmimim bifnim shelo l'shem baylim. It would be a case ultimately again of where Ruvain stole a carbon ultimately from Shimon, and Ruvain offered it up in the Beis Hamikdash, but not for Shimon. Not for Shimon. So in other words, he just offered it up. He offered it up l'shem shlamim, but not for Shimon. So now what's the problem? The problem we're going to have in this kind of case over here is that halacha l'maisa, the carbon is not going to count for Shimon, right? But the problem is that what? Shimon is achrei to now replace that animal. So therefore, that would be a case, that's Reb Shimon's case, of where Ruvain steals a consecrated animal, he'll be chayiv kefil for the theft, and he'll also be chayiv dalid vehei for the slaughter. That's Rabbi Shimon's interpretation, right? Because again, since he slaughtered it, albeit l'shem shlamim, at the end of the day, and therefore again, it's a shchita re'uya, it's a good shchita, but it doesn't set. But Shimon now still has to replace the animal to satisfy his sacrificial obligation. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, Ruvain will be chayiv dalid vehei. Good, that's Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish said, what are we talking about over here? Reish Lakish said, we're talking about a case of shochet bali mumin b'chutz. We're talking about a case where ultimately, again, where Ruvain stole an animal that Shimon had consecrated, but the animal became blemished. So we'll say, what do you do with a blemished, consecrated animal? What do you do with it? You redeem it. So in this case over here, so Ruvain took that animal and he shechted it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Now remember, that's totally permitted. So it's a shchita ruya. The problem is that Shimon is still going to have the obligation to go ahead and provide for that redemption money to go ahead and create another consecrated animal. So we'll say, so therefore again, that would be a case also where Ruvain the thief would be chayiv for dalid vehei. Okay, so all that's happening over here is machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. What is the case of Reb Shimon, of Kadshim, where you're obligated for achrayis, you have responsibility for it, and you'd be chayiv kefel and dalid vehei. That's so machlokes in the case. Now, the Gemara just points out over here. The Gemara says like this. So good. So we'll say, so then I'm just working through it. So then comes along Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Elazar said to Rabbi Yochanan, here's the problem. The problem is in these cases is shchita is not the matir. What's the matir? Zrika. So we'll say, see, here's what's interesting. So the Gemara is suggesting that this is a shchita ru'uya. It's not really a shchita ru'uya because it's not that shchita that makes the animal permitted, but rather again it's the zrika. To which the Gemara says, you're right, and the same thing with Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, it's not the shchita that's matir, it's the pidyon that's matir. To which the Gemara says, ishtamite had Rabbi Shimon, kala omei lizra kizark dami, v'chala omei liftovs kepadu dami. So let's begin from here. We'll say, so we're now on Ayin Vav Amud Beis 76b, and let's actually pick up 6 lines down from the top. We read a couple of lines further, but now we're reoriented a little bit more in the sugya. So the Gemara essentially says like this: you forgot about the statement of Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon holds anything that is fit for zrika, it's as if zrika has occurred. And anything fit for redemption for pidyon, it's as if pidyon has occurred. So where do we see both of these cases? And this is interesting in general. I will say, where do we find that anything fit for zrika, it's as if zrika occurred? This sign, because we're in the Brisa, Rabbi Shimon Omer, yesh nosar shumatami tumasochlin, veyesh nosar she'en matami tumasochlin. We'll say, ultimately again, there is a nosar. Remember, we spoke about this yesterday. What's nosar? Anytime you have a carbon that is left over past its permitted window of consumption, that is called nosar. So there's sometimes that nosar contracts tumasochlin, can become tameh with tumasochlin, and sometimes that it can't. So when is it ketzad? So the Gemara says, Lon lifnei zrika. So now watch this. Let's say you sacrificed an animal, right? You brought a carbon, and ultimately again the carbon remained overnight without zrika. without zrika. We'll discuss. Well, we're gonna define the parameters of that case a little bit more in just a moment. And in that case, ultimately, the carbon, right, or the item does not, the carbon in this case, does not go ahead and is not mitame tumas ochlin. La'achar zrika, if, however, again the animal remained overnight after zrika, mitame tumas ochlin, then ultimately, again, then it becomes mitame tumas ochlin. So the Gemara says, what's the case? The Kaimalon, Mylif Zrika. What does it mean when we say that ultimately, again, the animal remained overnight before Zrika? What does that mean? So the Gemara says, Kodem Shenira Lizrika. It means ultimately, again, that the animal remained overnight before it was fit for Zrika. In other words, they both say, Lav Dafka that Zrika was done, but rather what? Zrika could have been done. Li'achar Zrika, what does it mean after Zrika? La'achar Shenira Zrika, after it became fit for Zrika. So the Gemara says, still, what does this mean? Kodim Shenira Zrika lan Maya. We'll say, what does it mean that the animal remained overnight before it was fit for Zrika? The lo havya shahus bayom lemizrake. We're talking about over here a case where what? There wasn't time during the day to do Zrika. In other words, Rabbi, remember again, the halacha is that Zrika has to be done by day. Can't do Zrika at night. So let's say for argument's sake, he says, so for example, let's say you went ahead and you shechted the animal right before Shkia. Right before Shkia, to the point that now once Shkia comes, the animal is, once the Shechita is done, it's already after Shkia. It's already after Shkia, or right at Shkia. So now you no longer have the ability to do Zrika. So because ultimately, again, you didn't have the ability to do Zrika, therefore what? The carbon, or the sacrificial meat, does not contract tumas ochlin, right? The Gemara says, so now because, and again it's logical, because remember Zrika is the matir, right? Zrika is what permits everything. So now both say, technically speaking, if a carbon sits overnight, then ultimately again, that's when it could, let me say it differently. Once you do Zrika, then ultimately it contracts tumas ochlin. If you can't do Zrika, then by definition, the sacrificial meat cannot become subject to tumas ochlin. But what does it mean you can't do Zrika? You can't do Zrika means you shechted right before Shkia, there was no time. So there was no time, therefore again, when the carbon sits overnight, it doesn't contract tumas ochlin. What does it mean, however? The achar shenira lizrika. So I'll say, what does it mean after it became fit for Zrika? What does that refer to? So the Gemara says, la'achar shenira lizrika, lon dahavya shaos bayom lemizrike. Mitame tumas ochlin. So we'll say, what does it mean after it becomes after Zrika? It means after it became fit for Zrika. Meaning what I will say, that if you shechted the carbon with enough time by day to be able to do Zrika, and ultimately again you don't do Zrika, it's mitame tumas ochlin. So first of all, just an interesting halacha in karbanos, which is that halacha l'maisa, sacrificial meat only becomes receptive to tumas ochlin once Zrika was done. But what's interesting is that it's not really once Zrika was done. What is it? It's once Zrika could be done. Once Zrika could be done. So what do you saw there? Therefore, halacha l'maisa, if you shech the carbon right before Shkia, so therefore again, Zrika could never have been done, even if the sacrificial meat now sits overnight. What's the halacha? Ultimately, it's not mitame tumas ochlin. Why? Zrika could not have been done. Conversely, if you shech the carbon early enough in the day, where Zrika could have been done, but let's say Zrika wasn't done, what's the halacha? It is mitame tumas ochlin. What do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, it's interesting. It's not really about if Zrika was done. Rather, what is it about? If Zrika could have been done. So we'll say, so this is the concept, Rabbi Shimon's concept, that ultimately, again, kala omed lizrok, kizarok dami. Anything that was fit for Zrika, it's as if Zrika was done. And conversely, if Zrika could not have been done, so therefore halacha l'maisa, obviously as if it wasn't done. So that's the concept. Alma, what do you see from here? Kala omid lizrok kizarok dami. Therefore, I will say anything that ultimately, again, is fit for zrika, or was fit for zrika, it's as if zrika was done. What about the second case? V'chal omid liftos kipadoi dami. Soon again, I will say anything that is fit for redemption is as if it was redeemed. So what case is this? The Gemara says, Desanya, Rabbi Shimon says, there was a top of Ayin Zayin. Well, it's not really a top or a bottom. There's just Ayin Zayin. Let's listen to this. So this is actually a fascinating case. This time Rabbi Shimon Omer para. We'll say para duma. They will say now para mitame tumas ochlin. This is fascinating. We'll say now remember para duma is very unique. How is it's unique on a number of features. Para duma, remember, is not shechted in the Beis Hamikdash. Right, Paraduma is shechted on Harazesim, right, Mount of Olives, opposite the Beis Hamikdash. In fact, I will say today, I haven't mentioned this before, we know the site where the Para Aduma was shechted. Actually, it's a monastery now, right? It's so I don't think it's an in-use monastery, but at least there was a monastery at a certain point in time. So we know the area where the Para Aduma was. The Para Aduma sits on Har Zeizim because, again, the Mishnah describes in great detail that you were able to see from the site of the Para Aduma right into the Beis Hamikdash. In fact, my boys, their bar mitzvah Parshas Chukas, on the summer before their bar mitzvah, we were in Eretz Yisrael, and we practiced their laning right on the site on Har Zeizim, right on the site opposite, Har Zeizim opposite the Har Habayis. Quite an amazing experience. So the Gemara says it's also para mitame tumas ochlin. So para aduma. Ultimately, again, I should give a shkoyach to their bar mitzvah teacher, to Gabi. Also he did a great job. They were well prepared. Right? So the Gemara says so para mitame tumas ochlin. So remember again, para aduma, the meat. So remember, so going back for a second. So para aduma is actually shechted outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So interestingly enough, para aduma, the meat of para aduma, is metame tumas ochlin. Right? Literally, again, it can contract food tuma. Now, why? Hoil v'haisala shasa kosher. Because I will say there was a time when it was permitted for consumption. Now, look at Rashi just a moment. Para, Rashi says, aduma metame tumas ochlin, tahavili shasa kosher, le'echol mishenishchita v'yardala toras ochel. So this is fascinating, I was saying. There was a moment after the shchita of the para aduma where, technically speaking, it was fit for consumption. It was fit for consumption. Now, because it was fit for consumption in that moment after it was shechted, therefore what? Therefore, halacha l'maisa, it is metame tumas ochlin. Remember, I will say, they go hand in hand. Anything that is fit for consumption, ultimately, again, is able to contract tumas ochlin. So therefore, para aduma has its moment where ultimately it's able to go ahead and contract tumas ochlin. Amud beis, v'amrei shlakish. Right on schedule. That is great. Right, don't worry, we'll fall behind. But Reish Lakish says, listen to this. Omer Hayir Rabbi Shimon, para niftis agabe ma'arachta. Now, I'll say this is fascinating. It's nice because we have the opportunity to really delve into this a little bit. So Reish Lakish says that you could, technically speaking, redeem the paraduma while it sits on the pyre. Remember, again, I'll say, what's the process of paraduma? You shecht it, and after you shecht it, what do you do with it? You burn it. Remember, the whole avodah of the paraduma is with the ashes. So Reish Lakish is like this. You shecht it, the pyre is sitting on the pyre, right? Pyre, right? Why is it sitting on the pyre? Because you're going to burn it. You want the ashes. So Reish Lakish says you could redeem the paraduma while it's actually sitting on the pyre. So the boss says, look at Rashi for just a moment. Amr Lakish, Ezu Shasa Kosher Haisel. And the boss saying, now here's what's interesting. So we have two statements over here. On one hand, we have Rabbi Shimon saying in the Braisa, that para aduma contracts tumas ochlin. Why? Because it has a shasa kosher. It has a time where, technically speaking, you're able to eat it. So comes along Rish Lakish says, really? Like, when are you able to eat para aduma? I don't understand. You shecht it, you burn it. At what point in time is it technically fit for consumption? I'll tell you when. Technically speaking, after you shecht it, while it's sitting on the pyre, you could technically redeem it. In other words, if you decided you are hungrier than the need for, right, I'm more hungry than the need for national atonement. It happens, right? People get hangry, they get hungry, right? All kinds of things, right? I need to eat para aduma more than the nation of Klal Yisrael needs, of atonement or ritual purity. So Reish Lakish says, technically speaking, while sitting on the pyre, you could redeem it. Look again, now look at that Rashi. Rashi says, Reish Lakish, Ezu shas hakosh haisala. When did the para aduma have a point where it was fit for consumption? The Omer Haya Rabbi Shimon para niftis afilu nishcheta al hama'aracha kimishpat imatza acheres yafa mimene. So we'll say. So now remember, technically speaking, you could redeem para aduma, right? And you could actually go ahead and decide to eat it, but there's a caveat. What's the caveat? You would have to have a nicer replacement. In other words, I will say, if you did find a better para aduma after you shechted and before you burnt the first, then eina chinami, what you technically could do is redeem the para aduma that is shechted and sitting on the pyre. Go ahead and use that for food or for whatever you want, right? And lemaisa replace it with a nicer para aduma. So the Gemara says, "Vizehu sha." I'm really finishing Rashi. Vizehu shas hakosher shela afa pish delo niftis afilu hachi mashvile ochla hol v'ru'uya liftos. So both say this is fascinating. Watch how all of this comes together. So now Rabbi both say, let's just keep track of what it is that we're trying. What are we trying to do over here? We're trying to prove Rabbi Shimon's principle that something that is fit for redemption is as if it was actually redeemed. Now watch this. Where do we see this concept from? Para aduma. Get ready for this. I'm shechting a para aduma. Halavai we should be zolchem Eretz Hashem. I'm shechting a para aduma. The moment I shecht the para aduma, the Rabbi Shimon says it is metame tumas ochlin. Now Rabbi say the only time that something becomes tameh with tumas ochlin is when? When it's ochlin. Right? In other words, if you're not food, you don't contract tumas ochlin. So this begs the question, para aduma contracts tumas ochlin? That doesn't make any sense. To which the Gemara says, yes, it does, and I'll tell you how. Because Reish Lakish comes along, and Reish Lakish says that technically speaking, when that para is on the pyre, it's redeemable, right? But only when, if you were to find another para that was nicer than the first, you could shech the new para and redeem the old para and eat it. Now, both say, now here's what's interesting. Are you currently redeeming the para that's on the pyre? Are you redeeming it? The answer is no. But what? You could. So what do you see from here? Since you could technically redeem this par that's sitting on the pyre after its shechita, since technically you could redeem it, therefore what? It contracts tumas ochlin. What do you see from here? That anything that is fit for redemption is as if it was redeemed. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, this para, even though it's not redeemed, since it could be redeemed, therefore it's treated as if it was redeemed. And if it were to be redeemed, it would have the status of ochel and contract tumas ochlin. Therefore, it contracts tumas ochlin now, even though it hasn't been redeemed. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. What do you see from here? That kala roy liftos kipadu idami. Anything ultimately, again, that could be redeemed is in halacha as if it has been redeemed. So therefore, I will say we see the illustration of both of these principles of Rabbi Shimon's concept, that ultimately, again, kalarai lizra kizarak dami. So anything that is fit for zrika, it's as if zrika occurred. So therefore, again, I both say that we prove that from the case of if you shech the carbon and there's enough time in the day to do zrika, right? Even if you didn't go ahead and do zrika, right? Ultimately, again, the carbon contracts tumas ochlin, and anything that is fit for redemption is as if it has been redeemed. We see that para aduma case. Every para aduma has the ability to contract tumas ochlin, since technically speaking it is fit to be redeemed while on the pyre. Incredible. Now I will say, just to take this full circle, what does all of this do for us? What does all this do for us? So remember again, I will say that halacha l'maisa, what this does for us is this allows Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish to set up the case of Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah, right? Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah, remember again, Rabbi Shimon wanted to make this distinction between kachim shechayiv ba'achrayusam and einav chayiv ba'achrayusam. So if Ruvain steals from Shimon, ultimately, again, the type of carbon that Shimon has a replacement obligation for, so Rabbi Shimon says you are chayiv dalid vehei. That's Rabbi Shimon's coming along to teach us. So as we'll say again, one more piece, and then we'll go back to the Gemara. Remember, the Tana Kamma in the Mishnah said, if you steal essentially a consecrated animal, right? So and you shecht it, what's going to be the halacha? What's going to be the halacha? What did Tana Kamma say? What's the halacha? Right? You're going to be chayiv kefil, right? But you're not going to be chayiv dalid vehei. Rabbi Shimon is trying to come up with a case where even for a consecrated animal, you're going to be chayiv dalid vehei. And what's that case? What's that case? It has to be a case where you're stealing a carbon, Reuven stealing a carbon for which Shimon will still have achrayus for. So now Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish is just trying to come up with those constructs. What are the cases for which you'd be chayiv? What's the case of stealing a carbon that you have achrayus? So remember again, now we have Rabbi Yochanan telling us that it's a case of where Reuven's stealing a consecrated animal, he's shechting it inside of the Beis HaMikdash. All sounds great, only one wrinkle, he doesn't shecht it for Shimon. He shechts it for himself or for something else. So now Shimon still has achrayus. And Arabos say now what we've shown, and Reish Lakish, ultimately again you're shechting Bali Mumin outside. I need it to be a shchita re'uya, because it's shchita she'ina re'uya. The whole thing doesn't work, because again, Rabbi Shimon holds that a shchita she'ina re'uya is not a shchita. If it's not a shchita, then you're not chayav dalid vehei. Now Rabbi say now the whole, it's beautiful. All the pieces now come together. Now the whole thing works. It is a shchita re'uya. It is a shchita re'uya. Ultimately, again, because as long, again, anything that's fit for Zrika, it's as if Zrika is done. Anything that's fit for Pidyon, as if Pidyon is done. Beautiful. So both say, so now the universe is once again in equilibrium. I will say, I will just tell you, it's fascinating to contemplate this concept of also Kalarai Lezrika Kizarak Dami and Kalarai Liftos Kepadui Dami. I will say, you find this tension in halacha that sometimes, like, halacha will recognize the possibility of, or I should say, the potential, and sometimes halacha only deals with what's in front of it right now. Like, a davar shalab ali olam, right? Something that does not yet exist, right? You normally cannot transact with things that don't yet exist, right? Dvarim shebalev einam dvarim, right? Which is interesting, right? So halacha lamaisa. So right. So in other words, if I try to sell you futures, right? In halacha you can't sell a future, right? I can't sell you fruit that will one day sprout on my tree. Doesn't exist. It's a davar shalab ali olam. You can't do it, right? Dvarim shebalev. If at the end of the day we're transacting something and I'm thinking something a little bit different in my heart, dvarim shebalev einam dvarim. So yet you see in halacha that what matters are things that exist. Yet, what do you see? That kalarai lizrok kizarak dami, kalarai liftos kipadoi dami. So both say, so it's interesting, right? It's interesting how sometimes halacha takes into account things that don't exist and sometimes it doesn't. Both say there's a fundamental distinction between the cases. What's a fundamental distinction? Let's say in the case of kalarai lizrok kizarak dami, they both say, what's the difference? What's the difference between that and let's say davar shalab ali olam? The item is there. Right, the animal is shechted, the carbon is there, the blood is there, just hasn't been sprinkled. Right, in the pidyon, the paraduma is there. Right, just hasn't been redeemed. And we'll say, so in halacha, you don't need the complete action to have come to fruition, but Lamaisa, the genesis of it has to begin. I will say it's the same thing in life as well. And sometimes in life, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does, not sometimes in life, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't necessarily need us to bring things to the finish line, but He does need us to start. You see, a lot of times where we get stuck is Dvarim shebalev einam dvarim, having nice ideas and beautiful goals and aspirations is fantastic, but if they just remain in your heart, they just remain in your mind, but you don't bring it into the world of reality at all, that's meaningless. But if you bring it into the world of reality to some degree, even if it doesn't fully materialize or fully actualize, so that's ultimately, again, Siba say, if all I have are nice ideas, nice goals, and nice aspirations, so that's a davar shalab ali olam. Right? That's dvarim shebalev. So that's einam dvarim. But if I have beautiful goals, ideas, and aspirations, and I begin to birth them, but at the end of the day, they don't really ever fully mature, ever fully materialize, It's okay. Why? Because we'll say that's kalarai lizrok kizarak dami. That's kalarai lepidyon kipadwe dami. Because there already I've done something. As long as I do something to bring my wants, my goals, my dreams, my aspirations into the world of reality, that they're here, then ultimately again, that's real. That's real. Just remains in my heart, just remains in my mind. That's dvarim shala ba'oli olam, and that's meaningless halacha. So we'll say this beautiful dichotomy in halacha is the same dichotomy in hashkafa. If you just dream about what you're going to do, that's meaningless. If your dreams begin to take root, even if they don't materialize, that's meaningful. True in halacha, true in hashkaf. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Bishlama, let's try to finish the Amid. Bishlama Rabbi Yochanan, La'amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So we'll say, I understand why Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold like Reish Lakish. So we'll say, Rabbi Yochanan was the one who set up the case, as Rabbi Shimon's case, as talking about a case, ultimately again, of Shochet Tmimim Bifnim Shelo L'Shem Bailim. Right? Reuven the thief shechted Shimon's carbon in the Beis Hamikdash, all good. Only one issue, he didn't shecht it for Shimon. Right? Reish Lakish, we're talking about a case where Reuven stole a blemished animal and shechted it bachutz. Right? Shechted it bachutz. So I understand why Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold like Reish Lakish to kabay lo'ukma l'bas nisan afilu b'tmimin. Because we both say Reish Lakish is setting up the case in a very narrow scope as talking about blemished animals. Rabbi Yochanan would rather talk about consecrated animals, kind of all consecrated animals, even unblemished ones. But why does Reish Lakish not hold like Rabbi Yochanan? So very simple. Amar lo utevacho umecharo. Rabbi say because the pasuk says. Remember again, Rabbi say the pasuk says. Utavacha is at Shem, sorry, it's actually Utavacha o Macharo. Right? The pasuk says, remember, it's about the obligation of Arba v'chamisha, 4 and 5 time penalty payments. The pasuk says, the thief slaughters it or sells it. Watch this. Kol hecha de isa b'mechira, isa b'tvicha. So both say, Reish Lakish is like this. In order to be chayiv dalid v'hei, right, the thief has to have the ability to either sell it or slaughter it. You have to have both of those options available. If both of those options are not available, you're not chayiv dalid v'hei. So and again, Reish Lakish says that's lashon the pasuk utavacho o macharo. What is the thief doing with it? He's either slaughtering it or he's selling it. Kol heicha de'isa b'mechira isa b'tvicha. V'kol heicha de'lasa b'mechira lasa b'tvicha. Shabbos says a really profound yisod. So Reish Lakish says, Torah is telling you, wherever you could slaughter it, that's where you could sell it. And wherever you could sell it, that's where you could sell it. But if you can't do either of the two, then ultimately you're not chayiv in dalad v'hei. Watch this, Rabbi say. How is Rabbi Yochanan setting up the case of Rabbi Shimon? Remember, how is Rabbi Yochanan setting up the case of Rabbi Shimon? He's talking about a case of where Reuven is stealing a shlamim and offering it up as a shlamim. Rabbi say, that can't be the case of Rabbi Yochanan. Why not? Why not? You can't sell a shlamim. You can't sell a shlamim. So because you can't sell it, Reish Lakish holds that therefore what? There would not be dalid v'hei liability for slaughtering it. Now, remember, Reish Lakish is kind of backing himself into this corner. Why? It's actually because remember, Reish Lakish is subscribing to this drasha, right? Utavacha o macharos. Reish Lakish is telling, the way Reish Lakish is reading the pasuk is he's saying that halacha l'maisa, the way the Torah is telling you is you have to be able to do both of these things, right? If you can't do both, then you're not chayiv dalid. I will say there's a tremendous Musar Haskell in this. What's the Musar Haskell? I will say Reish Lakish is forced into his position because this is how he reads the pasuk. I will say how many times in life do we create realities for ourselves, and those realities dictate everything else, right? I see life as this, right? This is the way things are, so because this is the way things are, therefore halacha l'maisa, right? The rest of life has to fall in line. It's incredible, right? Reish Lakish reads the pasuk this way, so because he reads the pasuk this way, he cannot hold like Reb Shimon. The Gemara says, "V'hani kadshim hoil dechi mizdabin kadshim lo havi mechira lestu b'tvicha." Therefore, Reish Lakish says you can't sell karbanos. I just want to point this out, right? If you try to sell a shlamim, it does not work. You can't sell. Why can't you sell a consecrated animal? Why not? It doesn't belong to you. It's not yours. It's not yours. You can't sell that which does not belong to you. So therefore, I will say, Halacha L'Maisa, Reish Lakish says, I have to set it up as the case of a Baal Mum, because we'll say, interestingly enough, a blemished consecrated animal, right, a blemished actually can be sold. That's what's interesting about this, right? So Reish Lakish has his case, works for Tevicha or Mechira. Rabbi Yochanan, your case of literally, again, where the thief is stealing a shlamim and slaughtering the shlamim won't work because that animal can't be sold. The Gemara says, Vaitik. So Rabbi said, good. So that's why they don't hold to each other. Va'azlu Tamayu. Rabbi said, I watch this. Both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish go according to their previously held reasoning. Here we go. Both said this is actually a great case. The Itmar Hamocher Treifa L'Divrei Rabbi Shimon. So both said, now watch this. What's the halacha if a thief sells a treifa according to Rabbi Shimon? Now remember again, there's a lot going on over here. Rabbi Shimon is the opinion that keeps coming up. What does Rabbi Shimon hold? Rabbi Shimon holds shchita she'ena ru'uya lo shma shchita. Rabbi Yochanan holds this interesting sheet, I will say, that halacha l'maisa, in order to be chayiv for slaughtering a stolen animal, ultimately, again, the shchita has to yield an animal that is fit for consumption. If your shchita is not good, then you're not chayiv dalet vehei. That's Rabbi Shimon. So now watch this. So now here's the interesting shayla. What happens? Ruvain steals a treifa from Shimon. Remember again, what's a treifa? Treifa is any animal that has a condition from which it's going to imminently die. Okay, can't survive long term. So now watch this. So Ruvain steals a treifa from. Now I want to be clear, by the way. Rabbi Shimon's concept only applies to Dalet Vehei, right? Obviously, if Ruvain steals a treifa from Shimon, then what's going to be the halacha? Then Ruvain is chayv kefal. Right, that's obvious. The only question is now he slaughters it. So according to Rabbi Shimon, slaughtering a treifa animal, you're chayv the same kefal. In other words, nothing changes. You don't incur dalet vehei. Watch this. What happens if instead of stealing it, he sells it? He sells it. So I will say, so what's the halacha if you sell a treifa according to Rabbi Shimon? So watch this. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayiv. We'll say now again, chayiv what? Chayiv what? Chayiv what? Dalet vehei. Right? Reish Lakish Amar Pater. Reish Lakish says that you're Pater. Okay, so now let's analyze. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan says you're Chayiv. Afagav delay se betvicha ise b'mechira. Let me just say before we even get into this. Let me just say this outside. Essentially, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish have a yesodistic machlokes as to how to read the phrase utavacho o machro. That's it, right? Ki yignov ish shar oseh utvacho o macharo. So again, chamisha, right? Dalad v'hei. So Reish Lakish says tvacha o macharo means what? In order to be chayiv the penalty, you must be able to slaughter or sell this stolen animal. If you can't do one of the two, you'll still be chayiv kefel, but you're not chayiv dalad v'hei. Rabbi Yochanan says, what are you talking about? Utvacho macharo doesn't mean you have to do both, right? But rather, what does it mean? Or you have to be able to do both. Rather, what does it mean? You have to be able to do one or the other. So we'll say, so now again, now remember, this machlokes, just so you understand, like, this is very exciting, just because you understand, like, the layered, like, there's so many layers to this machlokes. So that's a machlokes by itself. The machlokes becomes further complicated according to Reb Shimon, because Reb Shimon says that what? The only time you're chayiv for shechting a stolen animal is when the shechita itself is a shechita re'uya. Ultimately leads to an animal that can be consumed. So we'll say, so now watch this. So now, where does this come to a head? In this case over here, Ruvain steals a treifa from Shimon. Ruvain steals a treifa from Shimon, right? So remember again, what's the halacha if you shech the treifa? Animal can't be consumed. So now watch this. But alas, Ruvain is not shechting it. What is he doing? He's selling it. So now we'll say, Ruvain steals the treifa, sells the treifa. Is he chayiv dalid vehei according to Rabbi Shimon? Now we'll say, now this is the machlokes of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So Rabbi Yochanan says absolutely yes. Reish Lakish Amar Pater. So here we go. Rabbi Yochanan Amar chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayiv. Why? Afagav delay se betvicha isi b'mechira. Very simple. We'll say because Rabbi Yochanan, when he reads the pasuk of utvacho macharo, doesn't require that you're able to do both of them. It's an either or. So granted, Rabbi Yochanan will say you're right. According to Rabbi Shimon, if you were to shecht it, you wouldn't be chayiv dalid vehei. But if you were to sell it, it's a bona fide sale. and you're chayiv daled v'hei. Reish Lakish says pater. Reish Lakish says you're pater. Why? Kevan de leisei b'tvicha, leisei b'mechira. Reish Lakish says halacha l'maisa. Again, utvacho macharo is a package deal. If you can't do shrita, then ultimately again mechira will also not yield a daled v'hei liability. Incredible. Okay, so both says this is our machlokes. So just to point out over here, now you understand why it's a two-tier machlokes. So now going back for just a second, Rabbi Yochanan chose to set up the case now. It's like a lot going on over here. So remember again, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are commenting on Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah. So remember again, Rabbi Yochanan chose to set up Rabbi Shimon's case as a case where Reuven the thief steals a shlomim and offers the shlomim in the Beis HaMikdash just not for the sake of Shimon the owner. So therefore again, Shimon's now out another carbon, chayiv ba'achrayis. Therefore Reuven the thief is going to be chayiv daled v'hei. Reish Lakish chooses to talk about a case of a blemished animal that ultimately again that was shechted without, that was right by the moment b'chutz. So I'll say, so now I understand why Reish Lakish didn't hold like Rabbi Yochanan, because ultimately again why? Because according to Reish Lakish, a carbonic animal would not work because Reish Lakish needs the animal to be able to be sold and slaughtered, but that doesn't work with a carbonic animal. So what's come out of Rabbi say is in this whole machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about how to interpret Rabbi Shimon, it turns out that there's actually something much more yesodistic at play between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which is how do you read the pasuk? Is utuvacho macharo, meaning that in order to be chayiv daled v'hei, you're only chayiv daled v'hei in a case where you could both slaughter and sell. But if both of those options are not at your disposal, you are not chayiv daled v'hei. That's Reish Lakish. Or no, Rabbi Yochanan tuvacho macharo is an either or. As long as you could do one of them, you would still be chayiv daled v'hei. Incredible. Ace Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. So Rabbi Yochanan is kasha Reish Lakish. We'll say another. It just gets better, right? So another kasha over here. Listen to this. Ganav kilayim. This is fascinating. We'll say, let's say you have a crossbred animal. Crossbred animal. That's kilayim. So you steal a crossbred animal, and what happens? Utuvacha, right? Ultimately, again, you shecht it, or treifa umachara, or you steal a treifa animal and you sell it. So what's the halacha? Mishalim tashlume arba v'chamisha. Ultimately, again, you have to pay the 4 and 5 times penalty payment. Now, I will say, now this is a brisa, right? So remember again, Rabbi Yochanan is just bringing this brisa as a kasha to Reish Lakish, because what do you see from here? You see from here, that halacha l'maisa. Right, says explicitly, if you stole a treifa animal and you sold it, you're chayiv daled v'hei. That would seem to support Rabbi Yochanan's reading of the pasuk that utvacha o macharo means either or. You don't need to be able to do both. Alma so the Gemara says, "My love, Rabbi Shimon." Is this Mishnah not also? Doesn't it also reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon? Because if you notice again, the brisa doesn't talk about shechting a treifa, right? The brisa just talks about going ahead and selling a treifa. So it seemed to be in line with Rabbi Shimon. And what do you see from here? We'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that Allah Chalamaysa, even if you can't shecht the animal, ultimately again there'll still be liability for selling the animal. So we'll say, so this seems to be a pretty good proof for Rabbi Yochanan. Our refutation of Reish Lakish. Absolutely not. No, lo Rabbanon. No, this doesn't reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon. Rather, it's the view of the Rabbanon. We'll say, what do the Rabbanon hold? The Rabbanon don't need a shechita ru'uya, right? The Rabbanon hold that in any case of shechting, even if the shechita does not yield an animal that is fit for consumption, you're still chayiv daled v'hei. So I will say, so just to point this out, so according to the Rabbanon, if Reuven were to steal a treifa from Shimon, and go ahead and shecht that animal, you'd be chayiv daled v'hei. So Reish Lakish responds, this price reflects the view of the Rabbanon. 1 second. I Rabbanon, treifa b'mechira isa b'zvicha lesa. Both say, if that's the case that it's the Rabbanon, then why does the price only talk about selling a treifa? You could also what? Shech the treifa michayiv daled v'hei. Ve'elamai, Rabbi Shimon. So you have to go back to what we said before. We must see that the Brisa reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon. To which the Gemara says, 1 second. Kilayim b'tevicha isa b'mechira lasa. If that's the case about the crossbred animal, why does it only talk about slaughtering the crossbred animal? You could just as easily sell it as well in michayev daled v'hei. Ella, we'll say, watch this. Ella tana tevicha b'hu adin l'mechira. So we'll say, rather, what you have to say is like this. You're right. when the Brisa talked about slaughtering the crossbred animal, it meant what? Slaughtering also meant what? Slaughtering and selling. Whereas, if that's the case, therefore, so we'll say, if that's the case, when the Brisa talks about slaughtering the crossbred animal, slaughtering really means what? Slaughtering and selling. So in the case of the treifa, I should also say that what? When the Brisa said selling, what does selling mean? What does selling mean? Selling means selling and slaughtering. If that's the case, I will say, whose opinion does it reflect? Whose opinion does it reflect? The Rabbanan. The Rabbanan. Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Lacha, Rabbi Yochanan will say like this. Hi, Mai. Okay, so we'll say, so therefore, what we have over here is a brisa that's a little bit strange to interpret, right? Because here's what the brisa tells me. The brisa tells me that if I take a crossbred animal and I shecht it, I'm chayiv daled vehei. And if I take a treifa and I go ahead and sell it, I'm chayiv daled vehei. So I will say, obviously, what's missing? So now again, it would be tempting to say that anytime you mention Tvicha, it also means mechira. And anytime you say mechira also includes tvicha. So let's analyze. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lacha, Hi Mai. All right, what's going on over here? So let's analyze. I Amit B'Shlomo Rabbi Shimon. So if you say that the Brisa reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon, I did the Tana Treifa Bechada, Tana Kilayim Bechada. So also you can say if it reflects Rabbi Shimon, so then really we're just kind of coming to establish Brisa symmetry. And since according to Rabbi Shimon, by Treifa, there's only one option, right? What's the only option by treifa? The only option by treifa is mechira, right? Because again, you can't shech the treifa because ultimately as we shchita sheina ru'uya. So since it only included one option by treifa, it only includes one option by kilayim of shchita, but not to say that you can't sell kilayim also, but lamaisa just to maintain some level of symmetry. So the Gemara says, I did the Tana b'treifa chada, Tana kilayim b'chada, el yamet Rabbanan. But according to the Rabbanan, if the Brisa really reflected the view of the Rabbanan, then what? Na'ar vinhu, v'nis ninhu. We should mix the cases together and list them as one. How so? Ganav kilayim utreifa. If Ruvain stole an animal that's crossbred or a treifa, tavchan umachran, and then you shechted it and you sold it. Mishalim tashlumi arba v'chamisha. Ultimately, again, you should be chayiv arba v'chamisha. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Kasha. So therefore, Rabbi say it turns out that how to read this brisa and ultimately again who it really aligns with is problematic. Because if it was really the Rabbanan, then ultimately again it really should have just listed the cases at once. In other words, if Reuven stole either a crossbred animal or a treifa, and then he sold it or he slaughtered it, ultimately he's chayiv arba v'chamisha. So it seems to be if the brisa is going to reflect anyone, it's going to reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon, and therefore again Rabbi say this would seem to be a proof for Rabbi Yochanan against Reish Lakish, namely that halacha l'maisa, that ultimately, again, the Brisa supports the idea that even though you can't slaughter, there would not be daled v'hei liability for slaughtering a treifa, because at the end of the day it's a shchita she'ena ruya, but there would be liability for what? Selling a treifa, which would seem to support Rabbi Yochanan's reading of the pasuk of utvacho o macharo. Doesn't mean what? It doesn't mean you have to be able to do both, but rather again, as long as you could do one of them, ultimately there would be liability for daled v'hei. I will say we'll stop over for today. Again, so I will say we're ending off a little bit on a cliffhanger. There's still a lot to do in terms of trying to figure out halacha l'maisa. How do we paskin by the reading of the pasuk, right? By extension, how do we paskin ultimately by? One more second. How do we paskin by? How do we paskin by the reading of the pasuk? That's number one. How do we paskin by Reb Shimon? Shchita she'ena reuya. And really, the overarching question is: do we even accept Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah of making this distinction by Kodshim, resolution to all of life's problems, or at least Baba Kamma, Ayin Zayin problems? Will Miraz Hashem occur tomorrow? We'll say Shkoyach. All right, Chevra Zoom, have a great day, everyone.